The UK government has announced £40 billion worth of tax rises in the Labour Party's first budget in 14 years. It's the biggest tax-raising fiscal event since 1993. But will it rebuild Britain, as the Finance Minister claims, or leave it lagging behind other countries? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, UK hospitals, schools and social housing are all set to benefit after the newly elected Labour government raised taxes to invest in public services. But it's being accused of breaking its manifesto pledge that taxes wouldn't hurt working people. Plus, there are concerns over the UK economy's growth. So, will the big gamble pay off?
Invest, invest, invest.
This was the message from the UK Finance Minister Rachel Reeves' highly anticipated budget. Full to the brim with tax rises, more borrowing and greater public investment to fill a funding gap of billions left by the former Conservative government. Reeves will raise taxes by £40 billion, much of it falling onto businesses, with employers' national insurance rising by 1.2% from April 2025. Reeves admits tax rises may impact workers, the very people the Labour Party said will not be affected by taxation. However, Reeves stays true to UK workers by increasing the national living wage for workers aged over 21 by 6.7% and extending the freeze on fuel duty.
The choices I have made today are the right choices for our country. To restore stability to our public finances, to protect working people, to fix our NHS, and to rebuild Britain. That doesn't mean these choices are easy, but they are responsible.
The Conservative Party leader, Rishi Sunak, is accusing Reeves of broken promises.
They have fiddled the figures. They have raised tax to record levels. They have broken their promises, and it is the working people of this country that are going to pay the price.
She wants the wealthy to pay the price, with hikes in inheritance tax, capital gains tax, which is a tax on profit, a value-added tax for private schools, and the scrapping of a preferential tax regime for ultra-rich foreigners. With an aim of repairing social services, Reeves plans to invest £6.7 billion to state schools, £22.6 billion to the National Health Service's day-to-day budget, £5 billion into housing and £2.9 billion into military spending. She also wants to invest through more borrowing, via her radical change to the way UK debt is calculated. So after 14 years out of power, can the Labour Party revive the UK economy?
Well, let's meet our guests. In the studio, we have Nigel Nelson. He is a political commentator. And Allie Renison. She is Associate Director at SEC Newgate UK, Public Relations, and a former policy advisor to the Business and Trade Secretary of State. And joining us from Bristol in the UK, Susannah Streeter. She's Head of Money and Markets at Hargreaves Lansdown. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Susannah, I'll come to you. This is a big, bold, ambitious budget from Rachel Reeves. Can she fix Britain? Do you think it's enough?
Well, this is certainly the aim. As you heard her mantra, invest, invest, invest. And that is why she has put forward and bringing in such huge tax and spending plans. Now, what we saw as far as the market reaction was pretty sanguine. Actually, there seemed to be quite a lot of confidence in the run up to the budget as far as the bond markets were concerned, almost a measure of opinion on the wider financial markets about whether or not she will maintain the UK's recently won back reputation for stability. If you remember what happened after the Trustonomics mini budget. So at the beginning, there was quite a muted response from the bond markets. But then after the budget, you saw gilt yields start spiking. And that indicates, I think, that there is fresh nervousness that has crept in about these huge spending plans. And there's going to be a really close eye trained on just what that investment will be spent on and whether that money will be spent wisely. And of course, there is concern that it could raise inflation as well, which is why interest rate expectations for cuts have edged lower. So I think it's still a bit of wait and see, but you can understand her ambition and why investment is needed, given that we've had such a shortfall here in the UK.
Allie, Rachel Reeves has effectively gambled on growth here, hasn't she?
She has. I think that she's hoping that the public, because ultimately at the end of the day, what they want is people to see this and vote them back in at the next election, that the public sees that the burden is sort of falling less on sort of individual consumers' shoulders, and that all this sort of from a business perspective, that yes, there is pain at the moment in the sort of short to medium terms in terms of this sort of collective sort of weight of sort of tax rises, but that this is all about a long-term kind of growth objective. I think the concern is that, it was referenced that it's all about invest. A lot of this is being done to help finance their public investment plans, but I can tell you that business investment needs to be part of that picture, and I think there's some concern about what some of the measures introduced are actually going to do in terms of having an impact, or at least certainly question marks around a positive impact on business investment.
And just tell me, we get all these prime ministers, when they come in, they all want to grow the economy. Does this give you confidence that Starmer and Reeves can now do that?
Well, they certainly have the tax receipts, or will have the tax receipts to do that from all the collective measures taken together. But ultimately, you need sort of the private sector to grow with you. It's not enough for the state, the government, to say, we've laid out a strategy for investment in, for example, the renewable energy transition. It was interesting to see that, to try and, I think, help sort of assuage sort of investors on the markets, that there wasn't a sort of absolute glut of kind of spending, but the biggest department that had its spending increased was the Energy, Net Zero and Security Department. So they're trying to say, listen, we want to do all this investment to show you that we're serious about our growth ambitions to sort of make Britain a home for investment in the renewable energy transition, but you need the broader private sector to come with you to make that a reality. It can't just be about what the state does.
Nigel, will Keir Starmer be worried about personal popularity ratings now? This is a budget where taxes are hiking for a lot of people, a lot of business. He's got 4 more years, so I guess he's more focused on the results in 4 years' time than any kind of negativity around his own personal polling right now.
Yeah, and that's the whole point, that the idea was to have a really painful budget first time round, with the idea the next few budgets will be much less painful. So yes, it's a very Labour budget. He's pleased his core supporters, so no increases in income or sales tax, that pleased people. There's minimum wages to go up, there's a freeze on motor fuel duty, and a penny off a pint of beer. All great stuff for his supporters. But I think that the point there is the growth figures are the ones that will really worry him, because they're looking at 2.5% growth by the time we get to the next election. Predictions at the moment are at 1.6. It's just not good enough. And so that'll be the key thing he'll have to aim at to try and get those figures to look better.
Susannah, you speak to a lot of people in big business across the UK, across the world. What do you think they feel about what's holding the UK back in terms of growing? What has been the major factors?
Well, we've got lower productivity here in the UK. Certainly the problems that we've been faced in the National Health Service with high numbers of inactive people who are out of the workforce, partly due to long-term sickness. That's part of the problem. That's partly why there's been such a big push into funding and creating more efficiencies within the National Health Service to try and bring those waiting lists down. There's also been an ongoing Brexit effect. I mean, that has dampened down appetite for investment in UK assets, and I still think that has been ongoing. And remember, of course, we've had quite a lot of political turmoil over the last few years. Now, that is why there has been such an emphasis put by Rachel Reeves on trying to give the impression that she is going to be extremely responsible with the public finances, which is why she has this rule that she wanted to borrow only to invest, essentially borrow more only to invest, and for day-to-day spending has to be covered through the tax rises, which is why we've seen these £40 billion worth of tax rises. This is all to create an impression that she is more prudent, she is more responsible, and that will help bring investment back into the UK. But of course, there is still this concern, given what's happened before, that that won't happen, and that actually there will be it could still be, she could still be fast and loose with the public finances, given what's happened before with previous administrations. So she believes it's very important to stay on that path and make sure she's seen as responsible.
Allie, I'm glad Susannah brought it up. Brexit, it's never mentioned. Politicians don't talk about it. Budgets come and go. Prime ministers come and go. And yet, from the outside looking in, a lot of people feel that the one thing that has held Britain back for almost a decade now was the result of that referendum.
Well, I was actually interested and surprised because they've not been trying to talk about it as much as you would think outside of Labour in respect of resetting EU relations. That in the preamble to her budget statement yesterday, she did mention, you know, when she was criticising the sort of the Conservatives' previous record in government, she mentioned the sort of the Brexit deal. First time I'd heard that in a long time. Now, the issue with doing that is that when you look at what Labour has proposed in terms of resetting EU relations, you know, an agricultural deal to some extent, maybe some recognition of each other's mutual professional qualifications, they're not transformational. So it's not something that they're going to be doing that's actually going to make a massive difference to the economy. You'd have to go back to the single market and the customs union have to do that. I think that the inward investment piece, you know, and business investment piece was hit by Brexit. I think there's been some restabilizing to some extent. I think the UK was second in Europe in terms of inward FDI projects in the last year or two. But what they're really hoping is that, you know, the other thing that Labour are looking at doing in government is an industrial strategy, a big 10-year infrastructure plan. So what they're hoping is that with all these sort of signals that we're really taking policy seriously, that the impact of Brexit becomes sort of less and less. They don't have to rely on going back to Brussels to say, hey, we need to redo this Brexit deal. Politically, that would be potentially economic suicide, political suicide. But also to say, we've got a lot of other things that we're doing in our domestic policy agenda that's going to win back the trust of inward investors.
Nigel, Rachel Reeves has said that the prize ultimately is a thriving, prosperous, growing Britain. I mean, everyone wants to see that. It always is, but that's ultimately why she's doing this, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So at the moment, we're talking about clearing the decks, that she would argue that there was a huge mess left by the previous government. She needs this budget to start again. So it's now her policies will come into play rather than clearing up the previous government's policies. There's a lot of argument about whether the Tories did make as big a mess out of things as Rachel Reeves claims, but that's politics. So yes, as long as that she can get the growth in the future, if we end up at the next election, Britain is growing, people feel better off, then Labour get a second term. If we don't, then the chances are that they won't. The vote is actually very fragile, that although they've got a huge majority of MPs, 2/3 of those MPs were elected by 1/3 of the voters. It could easily bounce back at the next election.
Allie, just come in on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that one of the things that came out politically out of the budget yesterday was some of the changes to, under less so business taxation, but inheritance tax, to business property relief and agricultural property relief, which effectively makes it harder for businesses to sort of pass their assets down without sort of getting the existing kind of quite generous tax relief on it. And the noise about agriculture, you know, everyone likes a shouty farmer. They get a lot of sort of airtime. I was really quite struck by how much noise there was. There were a lot of people that were elected for the first time under quite sort of tenuous majorities into rural seats, places that are traditionally conservative or liberal Democrats, and those two parties going absolutely really sort of a shot across Labour's bows on it. The additional thing is that sort of Scotland, there's a big workforce in Scotland that's dependent on oil and gas. The budget yesterday said we're going to extend the kind of the windfall levy on oil and gas sort of profits. So as you know, you were saying, the vote is very fragile. There's a lot of places that Labour weren't really expected to win traditionally. And I think that, you know, if you look at some of the other areas that they're doing, which are really good for investment purposes, really overhauling planning reform to get some of these big infrastructure projects going, great economically, the benefits of those are not always seen right away by people who live in sort of local neighborhoods, and they don't want a lot of big sort of developments right next to them. So there's a lot of ways in which that even if the policies they're putting in place are right for the long term economically, they may get a kicking at the next election for them in the short term.
Susannah, just give us a feel for the reaction from the international markets then to this UK budget.
I think there's been a pretty muted response. It's very much wait and see. The problem is there's not any kind of big fizz of growth. There had been hopes that this penny off beer, for example, would help the pub trade. You saw pub chains lift during her speech. But when you pick through the detail of the report from the Office of Budget Responsibility and assess that actually it's probably going to mean that there could be a knock-on effect on wage growth going forward, and that actually it would mean that people might not have quite so much money in their pockets as was hoped. And of course, the impact of the national insurance contributions onto wage bills. And that could affect bottom line for a number of companies, I mean, particularly the big retailers like Marks and Spencer and Sainsbury's with huge headcounts, big workforces right across the country. So I think it's a bit of well, we know there's more pain to come, but that, of course, was what the Prime Minister did warn, that there's going to be more pain, but the idea is that over the longer term, it will spur on more growth. The worry will be that these forecasts show kind of the opposite, a bit more of a spurt of growth, but then a growth tailing back off again. And of course, it's going to be up to the government to try and change that trajectory. But let's remember the OBR's forecasts have been wrong in the past. And actually, growth this year has been much stronger than many had forecast.
So, Allie, international investors looking in at the UK right now, seeing Starmer in charge and Reeves running the budget and the economy, is this budget more likely to have investment coming in? Are people more likely to look at the UK now and say, it's stabilised and you know what, I want to start investing in London, Leeds, Liverpool, Bradford, Aberdeen?
I think they'll be looking at the budget in conjunction with other fundamental policies, right? Because, one of the reasons, many of the reasons that people make big inward investment decisions is some of the foundational sort of strengths. And you can't necessarily change those overnight, but as was alluded to, the sort of productivity issue, access to skills, access to talent. But if you look at what Labour are trying to do in the long term, which I'll come back to about why that may not be necessarily the only thing to focus on from an investment point of view, the industrial strategy is going to really zero in on a couple of really key sectors. We're going to do a 10-year infrastructure plan to make sure that, combined with our planning reform, that we are really serious about sort of building. And through the budget, we are putting, whether it's through tax rises, whether it's through sort of changing the sort of fiscal rules to allow us to do the investment that we want, we are putting all these pieces together. I think the issue is, as always, politics. So, what is it that Labour are doing that the next Conservative government potentially, who knows, might want to undo? Labour have talked a lot at the moment about how they are probably one of the most, if not the most, sort of politically stable government in Europe. Are we going to be in the same position in 3 years' time? Because investors don't just look at things on a 1 to 2 year time cycle. So there's a lot of what Labour are doing there is the right direction of travel to really get the economy growing. The worry, I think, from an investment perspective is, are you going to be around to finish the job, and will someone else come in and do something totally different?
Nigel, you've been covering budgets a long time in your journalistic career in this country. Just tell me, we've always previously had a rabbit pulled out of the hat that the media weren't briefed about. I didn't see any rabbit.
No rabbits. No. I mean, what she said beforehand was that there weren't going to be any rabbits in this budget. It was heavily leaked, and some of it was right, some of it wrong. I think that when we actually came to sit down and watch the budget, probably the impression people got was, oh, it's not as bad as we thought it might be. And that was a deliberate government policy to put some stories out there that sounded pretty awful. One of the obvious ones was extending the income tax threshold freeze for another couple of years. She didn't do that, but that was very much mooted. It looked like she'd put extra duty on fuel. She didn't do that. So at the end of it all, it was kind of a few people were able to say, phew, that's a lot better than we thought it was going to be.
Susannah, what does it mean for working people? I know there was a huge discussion in the run-up to the budget about what is a working person. But I noticed minimum wage has gone up by 6.7%. So on the face of it, there are a lot of positives there for young working people in Britain.
So yes, minimum wage has gone up, but also I think that decision not to extend the freezing of the income tax thresholds is key as well, because it will mean that fewer people are pushed into paying more tax. So if you take that as a round, it should give people more money in their pockets, which is why you saw this kind of initial reaction, a positive reaction from consumer-facing stocks. However, there is a forecast that actually, because employers have to pay more national insurance contributions, that eventually will be passed on in the form of lower wages for workers and perhaps fewer opportunities for workers. But let's remember, there is all this worry that interest rates may not fall quite so quickly. But one of the reasons why interest rates haven't fallen quite so quickly is some members of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee have been really worried about stubborn wage growth, the high number of vacancies in the UK. And if that eases off, it might actually make it more easy for them to vote for interest rate cuts. So even though the financial markets are pricing in a delay to rate cutting, that's not necessarily going to be the case. And we just have to see how all of these effects really do play out across the economy. But clearly this was aimed at working people, those lower wage earners, and they are coming out of this budget better than other groups across society.
Allie, let's look at a best case scenario for Rachel Reeves and the United Kingdom. What starts happening then off the back of this budget for her, for things to go right and growth to happen?
Well, I think, to be sort of nakedly political about it, that, you know, she talked about sort of the spending and particularly sort of tax decisions, the painful decisions taken yesterday, would allow them to make, for example, a certain number more of sort of GP appointments, right? So can you start actually sort of putting numbers to those and saying we are actually delivering? Because that is what the government is going to be all about, is sort of delivery. Are we seeing sort of an increased number of inward investment sort of FDI projects? I think the sort of the worry there is that, you know, I would personally be looking at, you know, are business insolvencies on the rise, for example, or what is wage growth looking at? I think that's a really good point to make, because if you're a working person, you know, fine, nothing really sort of directly sort of bad happened to you in this budget, but the collective and cumulative impact of all the sort of changes to employers might mean that you don't have the next pay rise that you were expecting. It might be that, you know, there might be potential changes to, you know, your pension arrangements, your benefits. It might be that, you know, we'd like to think that actually it wouldn't necessarily be businesses looking straight to impact their workers, and maybe that they would just absorb the cost, take it out of their profits. But the cumulative effect of all that means that there is a genuine concern that actually that working people still may be hit in the form of wage growth being quite sluggish.
Nigel, from a working person's perspective, do you think this budget will be a success? I mean, what's been the mood in the British public?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be. I mean, there has been a problem over a definition of a working person. But if you sort of sub that down and say, right, people who get pay slips will see no tax increases on that pay slip, and a lot of them will be a little bit better off. Now, obviously, the national insurance extra rise on businesses will depress wages a bit, but people don't tend to notice money they haven't got. They notice the money that's actually taken away from them. The next stage for the government, which is the really important one that gets growth going, is to fulfill their ambition to have green electricity by 2030. If that happens, that's 650,000 more jobs. It means we lead the way in green technology in the world, which is the direction of travel of the rest of the world. And that's the way to actually deliver growth and make people feel better.
Susannah, I noticed they've kind of rolled back a bit from saying that they wanted Britain to be the leading economy of the G7. Do you think it was perhaps a little bit too ambitious?
Well, certainly if you take the OBR's forecast into account, it does look very ambitious. But if you look at the amount of money that is to be invested in the economy, 100 billion over 5 years, you can see why there is that ambition. But of course, because of all the kind of knock-on effects of some of these policies, in particular those smaller businesses, domestic businesses that are going to face these higher wage costs, it's likely to drag that hope back a little bit. I think what would probably happen, and we may well see, is this kind of acceleration to use new technologies much faster within companies. It's likely to lead to a greater reduction of headcount, but it could actually help the economy over the longer term. The UK is already forecast to be one of the nations able to benefit the most from the introduction of AI technologies. And I think this budget might, in fact, speed that up.
And Susannah, do you celebrate the fact that it's a woman delivering this budget, first time ever?
It was really great, actually, to see her stand up and pay tribute to her sister and just say to every woman and girl watching, look, this is what you can achieve. The first female chancellor, I certainly did applaud her, and many right across my workplace, many women, that's exactly what they had to say. And they said that she did a very fine job on her first major performance.
Allie, how important is it to have a chancellor who has worked in the Bank of England, understands money, understands investment, economy, growth, as opposed to a politician who's just been kind of shoehorned in there, which is what we've seen so many times before?
Well, you'd like to think that, you know, the at a basic fundamental level, that an appreciation for maths and how sort of economies of scale work is something that reassures investors that there's not going to be anything too. I mean, it was in some way a dramatic budget, but I think we knew which way it was going. There's a sort of clear understanding between, you know, if you look at the tax rises, we're not accompanied by massive amounts of spending rises. So, you know, very aware that while she wanted to draw clear blue water between her and sort of Liz Truss's mini budget as the height of sort of fiscal irresponsibility, and that she understands that, you know, there is only so far she can go because she understands market reaction. So I think that potentially, you know, calms some waters over the next few years and makes people feel that there's not going to be any huge surprises on the horizon.
Nigel, Allie and Susannah in Bristol, thank you all so much for your opinions on that one. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye. Thank you for watching.